Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Heather Conley. I'm Senior Vice President here at CSIS and have the great privilege of directing our Europe program. It is hard to believe that in 14 days we will be glued to our computer screens watching the results of a historic referendum in the United Kingdom on whether the UK will remain or leave a reformed European Union. We are so fortunate to have with us Tobias Ellwood, Member of Parliament, Conservative Party of Bournemouth East, here with us. Mr. Ellwood has been a Member of Parliament since 2005, and in July of 2014, he is selected to serve as the Parliamentary Undersecretary of State at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office for a very quiet part of the world, the Middle East, North Africa, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. So Mr. Ellwood is here on consultations, certainly on his portfolio, which is focusing on that important region of the world on counterterrorism, defense, and security issues. But we thought we would borrow him and his expertise, but because he is also a very active voice in the Remain campaign. So with that, please join me in welcoming Mr. Ellwood. We will have some opening remarks, and then we'll go to the chairs and begin to have some good dialogue. I've warned Mr. Ellwood that CSIS audiences are pretty tough questioners, so I think we're going to have a very lively discussion this afternoon. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Ellwood.
Thank you. Well, Heather, thank you very much indeed for those very kind opening remarks. I actually, as my portfolio suggests, I came across here to catch up with my counterparts and our strongest ally on some of the challenges facing the Middle East and North Africa. In fact, it was a pleasure to depart the United Kingdom, where we are going through a very interesting and unique period in politics, only to come to this side of the Atlantic and find out that you too are going through a very interesting and unique period in politics, but a lot more, I think, combines us than just those two aspects. It's a real pleasure to be in the United States, in Washington, D.C., and to be comparing notes, sharing ideas. I was in Tampa at the beginning of the week, seeing General Votel there and talking about aspects to do with the Middle East and North Africa in particular, and the work that we're doing in collaborating and working so strongly. And that, I think, is a nice segue, because it's a great example of the importance of the European Union to other countries around the world. Britain is seen as perhaps that anchor point from which other nations across the world understand, and the prism from which they perceive the EU. But we're having this referendum on the 23rd of June, and a lot of people are saying, well, if the government actually supports the European Union, why bother even having a referendum itself? Well, it's fair to say that the European Union is important. It's pivotal to Britain's interest to remain in it, but it is imperfect. It is also unknown. There is an awful lot about what the European Union does, as with many international organizations, and you could add the UN to that, which people are unaware of. And this entire debate over the last couple of months, indeed since the whole idea of the referendum, and David Cameron came back from Brussels in February with some changes, some guarantees as to where we're going, is actually all about educating the British nation, and indeed wider, of what the European Union actually does. And when people don't understand large organizations, then they don't give credit to those organizations if they're unaware of the good things they've done, but where they will certainly blame them for when things are going wrong, and they expect that organization to do well. So take the immigration issue of migrants coming across Europe, the issue in Syria. Why isn't the European Union doing more about it? What are we doing for those people on benefits tourism, choosing to leave Eastern Europe and coming along to the United Kingdom? If they get work, then fine, but if they don't, then they gain our benefits, which could be twice the value of that from the country that they come from. And then there's this whole aspect of the club that we joined in and came involved in 1970s to where it's actually turned out to today, one of which is supposed to be of economic union that has blurred into political union as well. And this is where the British nation is asking questions. This is where the British nation is rightly saying, I understand who my member of parliament is. I can make them accountable. I can deselect them. I can actually not vote for them. I can actually get in touch with them. But when it comes to my member of the European Parliament, or indeed a commissioner, or indeed what on earth goes on in Brussels, for many people, not just in the UK, then Brussels has moved into a very, very different place. It is not as competitive as it should be. It is not as transparent as it should be, and it is certainly not as accountable as it should be. But this referendum is about going through one of two doors. Do you say that all those challenges that we have, that we need to improve if we are to remain competitive internationally, if we are to deal with the security problems, if we are to manage some of the challenges in the 21st century, are we better off staying in that European Union, imperfect though it is, or do we exit it and try and go on our own? So this entire referendum has been a helpful exercise on taking a look under the bonnet of what the EU actually does, and saying that if we get through this referendum on the 23rd of June, it will not be the end of reform, but we will actually have a mandate to say this must continue on. And that is the British perspective. We have, I think, a good history of being pragmatic about international organizations, of wanting to be influential. Indeed, Britain's influence is amplified through our participation in organizations across the world. I think we are a respected power across the world with deep friendships, and in an interconnected world, that influence, that British influence, is exerted and able to reach the corners of the parts of the world that we can no longer do so because of where Britain actually is today. We have a very common sense approach to these matters. So we look at Brussels and say, yes, it is important that we participate, but we do want change. And we've tried to exert change, and we've run into the buffers in certain areas. And this is where this debate, I think, has come to a fore. Is Britain better outside, or are we better inside? Now, both camps agree that access to the common market, to the actual single market itself, is absolutely critical. But do we want to be in the situation whereby decisions about that single market are made inside a room similar to this, and we're on the outside of the glass door with our ears pressed up against it, trying to work out what's actually going on inside? Or do we want to actually be in the room itself? And not only just in the room participating, but in the room where other nations look to Britain for common sense, where other nations look to Britain to take the lead, to take the detail and understand what's going on. And I think, in fairness, the education that we're going through, people are starting to appreciate the changes that we could influence in Europe, the more Britishness that we could influence. But I think we should also be fair to say that we came to the club quite late. It had already established itself from the iron and steel market in the 1950s, but we were prevented from joining for different reasons, which we don't need to delve into now. But as you'll be aware, as you will know, we came very, very late in the day. And perhaps because of that, there was a bit of reticence about wanting to get too involved. But we were the ones that encouraged it in the first place. After the Second World War, we said to the European nations, along with America, you must never be so independent that you can actually launch war on another nation. You need to become interdependent, so you're reliant on each other. Well, in those days, we had the Commonwealth. We had trading with yourselves. There wasn't this big trading platform as there is today. And then before we knew it, we look over our shoulders, and it's already starting to develop into something quite interesting. And today, it's the biggest single market in the world. But I think Britain has been slow to recognize and to understand how the machinery works. We have been slow to recognize that regulations are created in Brussels, but we need to be there at the beginning of when those regulations are discussed, and not at the end and complain about the outcome because we didn't bother turning up in the first place itself. And we have got better in the last few years. David Cameron has been able to negotiate behind the scenes in lobbying other leaders to make sure changes actually take place. And contrary to what you actually hear, about over 95% of all the regulations that come out of Brussels actually have the agreement, we voted in favour of them. So that means we are showing a level of influence. And there's a few times where we've yielded our veto to say, particularly to do with financial services. And that, I think, is the big challenge for us to understand and cut away some of the myths that surround the debate at the moment. Yes, many of our laws are made in the European Union, but only about sort of 15 to 20% of them come from the European Union, not the 50% that the Brexit campaign suggests. It is 50% of business regulations, but not of all regulations. Health, education, defence, taxation. There are many issues where the sovereign nations have the ability to run their own affairs. But critically, when it comes to the single market, access to it is so important. And by stepping out of that market for however long a period will damage Britain's interests, and British companies are now standing up and saying, I have concerns about that. JP Morgan is a great example in my constituency in Bournemouth, who've actually said, we will have to review whether we remain this side of the European Union if you choose to actually leave itself. The pound itself is fluctuating, as you may have seen, in going up and down. And it is a worry. It is difficult to predict what would happen if we stepped out of the European Union. And this whole issue of, oh, it's a fearful campaign and so forth, we have to register that we simply don't know what the consequences would be. But we do know that we would have to queue up to get in line to actually reapply in order to join that single market. But it would cost us more or less what we're paying now, and it would also mean that we'd have to adhere to the very same rules of movement of people, of open trade and so forth that we do now. So that aspect wouldn't change. But as I mentioned before, we wouldn't be able to affect the rules itself. And I just end on this point of what Britain actually is, of who we are in the international community. We need to recognize that what happens in Europe affects us. It influences us as well. And we can either prosper from being inside the European Union, or we can be affected by the things that happen in Europe, but be outside of it. And it's much, much easier, I think, to actually fix a broken EU and mend it from inside, rather than being affected by an EU that then has the potential to really crumble and cause all sorts of problems in the longer term. So this is a major decision, but it is a decision that Britons are making and coming to terms with by learning more about what's actually going on. And I just end this with an illustration. It costs each individual in Britain 26 pence, which is less than a Mars bar, membership of the EU. It costs, you save that amount on the roaming fees that you used to pay because of the EU when they were actually introduced. So when you use your phone abroad, it costs the same more or less as what you're using actually in the UK. That is an illustration of how useful this, of the cheapness of our membership actually costs. But the access and influence of making Britain more economically and more security perspective in a better place and leveraging our influence is very, very important indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please. I'll let you right here. I'll say right there. Well, thank you so much. And again, we're so grateful that you could make some time and talk about this subject. A few months ago, many of you recall we had Liam Fox here, who gave a very robust defense of why the Leave campaign believes in its views, and so we're so grateful to have you here. I want to ask a couple of questions. I have to say, I don't think I could ever describe this process as a helpful exercise, and that is because for me it's been a very difficult, very painful process to watch both Europe in how it's had to address it, as well as obviously the internal debate within the UK. And so let me begin by asking you, sort of help the average American understand what the mood is in the UK right now, 14 days before the referendum. I was struck by, I believe it was last week, the Prime Minister gave a sort of a town hall interview on Sky News. He met a very, I thought, angry audience, not happy with the way the Remain campaign, or what is called Project Fear, the fear-mongering, How do you describe the mood? Are people understanding? You said the education. This is a monumentous decision. Do people have good arguments, or are they being scared into this referendum?
It's a very important question, and I mean, I touched on it myself. I don't think anybody can really predict what will happen if we step out of the European Union. They can't predict what Scotland will want to do if we step out of the European Union, although we can guess. They can't predict what will happen to other countries and their approach to Britain if we step out, but we can actually guess. And what we've not seen from the Brexit campaign is any detail, any analysis of where things would actually go. We've done our best to try and understand that, but all of us will look at the European Union and this question from our own perspective and say, how will it affect me? And what we're asking is people to actually say, not only how will it affect you, but how will it affect your children? How will it affect the country as well? So when we use this term Project Fear, every time we come up with another analysis or another individual's comments or a quote to say that there is a concern that we will lose influence, or there is a concern that we will bump into more tariffs, the other side immediately say, well, this is Project Fear. But then don't just say it's Project Fear. Turn around and say, no, it won't happen. And we don't actually hear that. I've not heard a single, or not seen a single document from the Leave campaign which has done its analysis, its cost-benefits analysis, to say, actually, we are better off out of the EU itself. Absolutely, there are some unknowns there, and absolutely, it is a difficult and indeed fearful thing to answer. But the nation must make a decision, must choose one of those doors to actually go through. And I firmly believe that Britain is better placed to remain influential as part of an imperfect European Union, where we are then given the remit to continue reform as we actually go through, but recognizing that the deal that David Cameron struck when he went to Brussels allows us to have a threshold on this ever political advance that was taking place and protect Britain's financial services, which is important for us. And that's, I'm afraid, the way things were working before, is that anybody outside the Eurozone was slowly being punished because they weren't part of that particular club. And we've got assurances that Britain's important financial services will be protected, and that is critical to Britain.
What's your greatest concern as you look towards this referendum? Clearly the economy. Are you worried about the unity of the UK? Here we have Tony Blair and John Major today speaking out very clearly about the impact that a Leave decision could have on Northern Ireland, border control between the UK and Ireland, Scotland you mentioned, or is it immigration? How do you control EU immigration? What do you think is of the greatest concern as you look towards the referendum?
Let's just take the immigration piece, because that is important, and it's the timing of the referendum just coincides with what is happening with the situation in Iraq and Syria, which has seen thousands come across Europe, and people then blaming the EU to say, why aren't you doing more about it? And I think it's fair to say that the EU is a amorphous organisation in the sense that it is growing and adapting, and politically it has got too involved. But what's happening is that when it's also a fair weather organisation, when the economy is going well, then the machine actually works. But when emergencies take place, which perhaps NATO in the past would have been that organisation, that construct, which brought the leaders together for an expedited decision making, the EU hasn't developed those systems yet. They're not in place in order to get the sanctions quickly against, let's say, a resurgent Russia, to deal with the movement of people across the EU. The plans were never in place, and that's because, as David Cameron has said, it has overreached itself in certain political arenas. And it's important that we recognise and distinguish and separate the challenge of the current migration issues, which can't all be blamed on the foot of the EU itself, in conjunction with whether or not we should remain in. And I'm afraid the Brexit campaign have done much to say we will be able to control our border. We control our borders now. We check every single passport that comes through. Every single criminal that comes through from Europe, we're given information off, and we can actually send them back. That's because we're part of various agreements and protocols. If we step out of the European Union, those will have to be renegotiated all again. So, the European arrest warrant is a great example. If we find a criminal who's from the EU in France, from France that's in Britain, we can then move them back straight away. As soon as we step out again, those will have to be renegotiated. Now, will any country be keen to have their criminals being returned back to their own country? It's not something that's going to be at the top of their list. We'll get round to it, but they're not going to be in a rush to have these criminals returned. And then there's the other 50 agreements that the EU has with other organizations around the world, from the patent agreement to the deal with Korea. Ironically, these are British civil servants, British Sir Humphrey Applebys, that have actually done those agreements, the details in that. We've been part of that planning to strike those deals. We don't have the machine to renegotiate that in the Foreign Office, to go back and do 50 other deals all again, or indeed go to individual countries in Europe and strike up new deals as well. That's going to be hugely costly, and it is the unknown, which is why more and more businesses are coming out to say, if we do go this way, I need the certainty, and I'm going to actually move my business back into the European continent.
Help us understand what June 24th looks like, and I want to unpack that a little bit. What does the Tory party look like on June 24th? This, to me, seems to be an incredibly personal and divisive leadership challenge. Some have suggested it'll be okay, we'll patch it up. Some have suggested it's irreparable harm, and the worst possible outcome could be a very narrow Remain decision where the party would just keep fighting this. Help us understand how the Tory party comes together on June 24th.
You know, if we had these crystal balls that could tell us, I wouldn't be in politics, I'd be doing something else. But it's always fun, though, to make a prediction. And if I can, using the limited access that I have to numbers, and the feeling I have in speaking to the electorate, not least in Bournemouth, is that many people who want to leave the European Union have felt that way for a long time. And their profile is normally of an older generation. They perhaps seek a Britain from that they remember in the past. This is not everybody. Some people genuinely have their own personal reasons as why we should leave, but it tends to be many of those have been pioneering for leaving the European Union for an awful long time. There's those of us who, like myself, who have been critical of the direction of the travel of the EU, but have not been so to the point where we've actually declared we want to get out, but now, on the balance of it, believe that we should remain in this imperfect organisation for the overall benefits. And then there's a younger generation that are unaware of what the European Union brings, the history all about it, and so forth. And when you then press these or speak to these younger generation, I understand over 70% of them, when pressed for an answer, are saying they want to remain. They believe, for them, it makes sense for Britain to be engaged, to be part of the international community, to be at the forefront, as we are seen and as is reflected in our history of being a significant player on the international stage. The question is whether they will vote, and that's the difficulty, whether they will be minded to actually come out and vote on the day. Because in most elections, it is the youth, the younger generations, that don't necessarily are as active voters as perhaps others. But the fact that the voter registration website collapsed as we approached the deadline yesterday and has now been extended is an indication that the youngsters are getting involved. And an example of this happening is the Scottish referendum, where again, the youngsters weren't so inclined, and as we came towards the date itself, they actually said, this is going to change. This is actually, it's not just like another political leader coming in or a party taking over and who runs Scotland, but actually this is going to affect us in a major way. I need to actually think about this. And that's where we're seeing, I think, a very interesting change. And I'm confident to make a prediction that we will win and remain in the European Union. And I'll be able to talk to you on the 24th.
Okay.
Now, putting my...
Good. We'll take that call. Thank you very much.
And say, I'm pleased with the election, with the result.
But Tobias, who's mobilizing those young people? The political parties, this is not an election. They are, this is not personality driven. The grassroots is not occurring. I mean, I have to say, the most optimistic vision you've given us, it's an imperfect union. I'm not sure that makes everyone feel strongly compelled. It's not an overarchingly positive vision. Who's mobilizing these young people?
No, it's not, and that is the challenge that we actually face. It's not a decision between a perfect model and then saying it's an imperfect model and therefore we should actually get out. It is actually saying what is in Britain's best interests to actually do in the longer term, and who we are as a nation. Do we step back and become an isolated country, expecting to lean on our old Commonwealth? We tried to sell aircraft to India, a great Commonwealth friend. They didn't buy our planes. They didn't buy the Typhoon. They bought the Rafale from the French. So it isn't automatic that we can actually lean on the Commonwealth. And anyway, it shouldn't be about whether we trade with Europe or the Commonwealth, one or the other. We should be able to trade with both. But about 50% of our trade is with Europe, and particularly in areas which are increasing, is in the services industry. So going back to the question about mobilizing the youth, it actually touches on another question which is a wider concern for people like myself in a grey suit, which is how well do politicians in the 21st century, in the world of the Twitter sphere, where people have perhaps less of a depth of understanding of the issues because it's all done in 120 characters or whatever it is, and yet somebody else comes along who has a personality and is able to say some incredible soundbite that just knocks the socks off everybody and then denies the airspace of those other people who are trying to actually put forward just a normal, rational comment.
I'm running my own domestic tapes on that comment. Absolutely. Let me go back, if I can, to June 24th. And let me run a few scenarios by you, and I would welcome your reaction. If there is a decision to leave, do you think it's politically feasible that the House of Commons would overturn that decision? The referendum is non-binding. It's not a legal device. Would that be even feasible politically in that scenario?
Yeah, I read that story.
Exactly.
I can't see that. I mean, Britain's sense of fairness, Britain's transparency, Britain's approach to fair play is something that we promote across the world. In fact, part of my job in the Middle East and North Africa is to use Britain as an example in its free press, in its decision making, to say, come and see what we do, apply it to yourselves and find a model that actually works to you. The idea that we could have a referendum and go through this entire national debate and then have the House of Commons not sort of endorse what the nation has actually said. David Cameron deliberately chose to have a referendum in Scotland to actually put the question and deal with the question for the generation in Scotland. So it's the people that tell the politicians of all hue what should actually happen. And whatever the result is, we deal with it. So my personal view is that absolutely, if the nation speaks, whatever the result is, we will then have to live with that actual consequence.
But I think that's a great point, because the Scottish referendum was supposed to end the question for the generation. But it seems to me that it almost didn't end the question. You now have speculation again that would Scotland return to another referendum if Leave wins the day. You have some in the Conservative Party even saying today that if Remain is decided, this question could be posed in 2020 at the next general election. Does this settle the question, or does the UK continue to battle this out?
Well, I believe that we will be successful on the 23rd, so I'm not sure the issue is going to come up. But the case has been made by the Scottish nationalists that they would want to address the question again, because they would say the parameters have changed. But we should remind ourselves that after the last referendum in Scotland, you actually had Alex Salmond very clearly say that this question has now been put for this generation and we actually need to park it.
So as you are doing your work and consulting with colleagues in the Middle East, how are you dealing with this question? I'm sure you're getting it everywhere, every capital that you're visiting here in Washington, or whether you're in Riyadh or wherever. How do you handle it?
Well, it is part of the democratic process. I remember actually being in at the UN one of the few times, and I was very honoured to be there, but being in the UN General Assembly, sitting in the UN Security Council, dealing with a resolution to do with Iraq, and John Kerry was in fact chairing it because it was the US that was dealing with that at the moment. And I gave the speech. I was quite nervous. I'd never addressed the UN Security Council, and I was very honoured to be sitting in that seat with the United Kingdom. And I gave the piece, and I was very pleased to complete it. And then it was the day after the Scottish vote.
Oh my.
And John Kerry said, "Tobias, thanks very much indeed. Great to, the support from the United Kingdom. And can I just say it's great to see that your country is still in one piece." And of course, rather dry atmosphere at the UN, everybody started to laugh. And I then looked at John and I said, thank you very much, John. The democratic process never stops. You know, we may have 800 years of Britain since the Magna Carta, the democratic process never stops. And he said, good answer. And that's exactly the approach here, is that the European Union has developed, but there needs to be checks and balances and a reminder that we answer to the people of the nation. So absolutely, you could say, the politicians, why bother having this referendum? Just go on and doing what you actually want to do. But we're hearing voices, not just in Britain, but across Europe, that to say, I understand the European Union, I know what's actually trying to go on, but I'm certainly unhappy with many, many aspects of it. And its popularity rating is going down and down and down. And that is reflected in who is getting elected across Europe, from what we saw in Austria, where the close shave there, what we're seeing in other countries, in Denmark and Poland and in Germany, where there are voices there growing to say, I no longer recognize what is going on in the European Union. It isn't transparent. It isn't as competitive as it should be. And it certainly isn't as accountable as it must be. And those are the challenges that David Cameron has made very, very clear, that unless we put those into check now, there will be consequences further way down the road. So yes, it is a very painful exercise, there's no doubt about it. And you touched on it, not least within the Conservative Party itself. But we need to do this, and it is the right thing to do, because remembering who we're responsible to, who we actually answer to, and that's the people of Great Britain. Just to touch on the interesting frisson that there is within the Conservative Party, yes, there are all sorts of voices, lots get said in elections, and perhaps I've been surprised by some of the actual comments itself. But if the analogy is a rugby game, there's a lot of...
This is a scrum.
physical contact, body-to-body slams, that sort of thing. But the whistle will go, a result will be called, and you know, in Victorian times, all the teams jump into the same good old Victorian bath. Now that's probably the wrong analogy for today, but we have a way in the Conservative Party of coming together after these events. In a way, I would argue that many other parties, indeed other parts of the, across the world, don't. We are very good at actually coming together and recognizing that actually there is a bigger requirement from us, from a party perspective, from a national perspective, to make sure that then we actually move forward. So it does look a lot, quite painful from the press perspective. I have to say, in the tea rooms in the House of Commons, we actually smile when we read some of these headlines, and you see the two people in front of you, chatting away, and yet apparently they're daggers drawn at dawn, and it isn't quite the case.
Well, that's good to hear. Do you think this referendum has unleashed forces in Europe that now other countries will demand their own referendums and in inspiration of what you've done, but in fact there may be more no answers than yes to Europe? Is that some responsibility that the UK may bear because of this process? I
think what we're seeing is and this is a great, an important point, there are some big sort of countries of polarity, if I can say that, in the European Union that attract other voices and that rally around them. And Britain, many countries ally themselves to the British cause and are frustrated because there's expectation that Britain stands up and says things when other larger countries come out with perhaps ideas which don't necessarily make sense. And so there is a real worry by other countries to say, if you leave, who's going to actually speak out for us? In a free market, liberal economy, who's going to be there from a security perspective? Who has that relationship with the United States that we also need in also, from so many aspects as well? And that is a massive concern. So what we're actually seeing is many countries saying, we're actually quietly pleased that you're putting this question and challenging the direction of travel for the EU. If we're frank about this, whenever in its history has the EU been challenged in the direction it's going on such a scale as through this referendum? And when you ask that question, I can't think of anything. Perhaps the Lisbon Treaty, when that was actually signed, and you had some ripples there, the Maastricht Treaty as well, but not in this way that is engaged with the nation. I think this is actually quite fundamental, but it is so important that we get it right, and that's where the education aspect comes of it, to make sure people are aware of the benefits that the EU brings, as well as the areas that are of requiring reform.
I want to ask you one last question. I'm going to turn to our audience to bring them into the conversation. Many pundits have suggested that this is all going to come down to turnout. I've sort of given up on the polls, online, telephone, the bookmakers, I don't know. But I think it's going to depend on turnout. Help us look at what if we see long lines on June 23rd, or if we don't. Help us understand what to watch out for on the 23rd. I read a story that said that, a little concerned about, we're delighted that so many people want to register to vote, but we're a little worried about the system crashing and some of the technological glitches that have occurred in some of the pre-runs for the referendum. What do we watch for on June 23rd?
I'm confident that there will be a big turnout. There is a gaining of interest. The two things are happening here. There is the slight frustration with the media picking up the biggest insult of the day and running with that as their title, and people just skip over that. But then many of the papers are doing a snapshot to say, oh, somebody's thrown in the Australian model on migration. That looks like a good idea. And then it gets actually knocked about a little bit to say that was actually introduced in Australia to increase migration, to actually encourage people to come in. You sign up for and you meet the points, you're allowed to go to Australia and look for a job. Well, that actually won't stop people coming into the country looking for a job, which is the challenge that Britain faces at the moment. So what we're actually seeing is more people gaining a better understanding, enable themselves to make a judgment of what's going on. I predict a good turnout taking actually place, and thankfully I also predict a large turnout from the younger elements, and that will be important. Would we see potentially a 10% spread? I'm thinking of the Scottish referendum. Will it be a close margin or a large margin? Well, you're asking me to predict there as well. I met with Jim Messina last night. He should know, President and I said, tell me what's going on, because this is, yes. But we do tend to turn to all these things. I mean, curiously, anybody that followed the British general election, and then all the polling companies came in to explain why they had got it so wrong. We analysed the wrong people, and the sort of person that gains $5 for going online and answering them, well, that's a certain type of person, therefore we missed out the busy people and the youngsters. The polling that we're actually seeing, the overall polls, are they to be believed or not? I'm confident, as I say, we'll have a good turnout and we'll have a good result. All right, well, let's turn to our audience, and I see lots of hands, so get ready. Here we go. If you could please identify yourself and keep your questions short. We'll try to bundle a few and then let Tobias answer. So I'm going to start from my left here, and we have some microphones coming to you. We'll start, sir, over there, and might just wait for the microphone. Thank you. Yes, please.
Joel Starr, former Deputy Assistant Secretary and Lieutenant Colonel in the Army Reserve JAG Corps, and I wanted to ask you a question about the issue of the EU Army.
Right.
That's been raised in the last couple of weeks. Some of my British military friends have been scratching their heads about this. I'm just wondering how that is playing.
Yes, Mr. Juncker. So we'll take, if you don't mind, we'll take just a few questions. And there was another, yes, in the back, sir, please.
CSIS intern with Lord.
Yeah.
But if the decision to leave the EU is made, is it far-fetched to say that this is the beginning of the end of the EU as we know it today, given the political polarization in Scandinavian countries, Northern, Eastern Europe, and the effects of the Syrian and the Yemeni conflict? And then what does this do to the collective European foreign policy in Africa and the Middle East?
Fantastic. I think already any other questions on that side. Great. Why don't we take those two?
Okay.
We'll go for it.
I asked this question to Federica Mogherini on Friday.
Excellent.
And I was very blunt. Is there going to be an EU army, Federica? And she said, Tobias, there will be no EU army. And I said, can I quote you on that? And she said, please quote me on that. There will be no EU army. I don't think you get any clearer than that. Politicians like to waffle, but I think that's a pretty straight answer, so I hope you're satisfied with that. The next one I may waffle on a bit, just because, again, we're stepping into the unknown. But this is a concern as to the ripple effect that we might actually see. Britain outside the European Union, for many reasons, it's a force of stabilization. It's a force of good within the EU. There are lots of competing agendas that are taking place, and we believe that our common sense approach, our practical, our pragmatic approach, is good for the EU. The EU benefits from British membership. And as I mentioned, there are concerns of ripples taking place because the Brussels machine is perhaps out of sync with the actual people itself. And if the EU doesn't recognize that, then yes, there could be dire consequences of a more siloed, more insular approach to countries and what they're actually doing. Because the politicians will be voted out of office, the moderate politicians because peoples themselves look for more extreme and isolated views.
Fantastic. So I saw some hands over here. We'll take, sir, you're in the middle. Andrew, right here. Coming to you.
I'll try to make my question brief, but I must make a little statement before.
Short statement.
Yeah, short. I think perhaps the EU has had a structural problem from its inception. That's my statement. My comment refers to the asymmetry between the European military defense architecture on the one hand, the European monetary system on the other, and the three-tier membership in the EU in the decision-making processes.
Thank you. I think if you can just pass the microphone there. Andrew, right there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm David Gavardo coming from the Spanish Embassy. So currently there are about, I think, 1 million British nationals living in Spain, and then a not quite as high, but almost as large number of Spanish nationals living in Britain, as well as quite a big deal of, quite a great amount of foreign direct investment coming from Spanish companies into Britain. So if the UK leaves the EU, what happens to these people caught on the wrong side, and what happens to these companies that have contributed so much money in their business?
I have to say, I've had some colleagues that are British colleagues that live in Germany, Cyprus, saying, we don't know what's going to happen.
Firstly, on the structural side of things, I hope that after the 23rd, there will be, and already work has been done by many people to take advantage of this focus. This is, the European Union has never had a microscope placed on top of it in the way that it is at the moment. And there are many aspects of the EU where things work well, but as I mentioned, there are things that are just wrong. The European Parliament, having 2 buildings costing I don't know how many millions, that needs to be resolved. That doesn't sit well with the electorate that wants good accountability and cost effectiveness. There are other aspects of accountability of the Commission itself in the way that it works. The power should actually be, I've long advocated, this is a personal thing, not make it very clear, not a governmental approach, but it used to be that parliamentarians, sovereign parliamentarians would go to Brussels and represent their country and come together around the table, so you'd have groups and discuss matters and then be able to go back. Instead, we created another layer of bureaucracy by having members of the European Parliament. I've long held that personal view, so there's nothing new. There's something earth-breaking here. But many people do believe that would create better accountability rather than having people that meet in 600-odd MEPs that cost an awful lot of money that nobody feels actually do a huge amount of work, or indeed do the checks and balances that you'd expect between the legislative and the executive. But there are aspects that we don't know about that could be looked at and advanced. We said there would be no European army, but there's an awful lot of funding to do with stabilization, post-conflict, and support that the EU can do collectively by combining the funds that actually come together. Frontex is an example of trying to provide support and stability in the Mediterranean. That needs more efforts and more engagement. That needs to be advanced. So that is actually a good thing. That's where the nations can actually come together. But there are other aspects where it's simply just a waste of money, where money is poured in and nobody understands actually what's going on. To do with the question of the Spanish and the British, and so nobody knows. Nobody knows what will actually happen. And this is the challenge that we face. Brexit have not been able to place any sort of understanding as to what any country how they will react by saying you're now not in the European Union. What actually happens to the deals that have been struck that allow you to live and work in the European Union? And the likelihood is that many of them will just set up their own standards, which could involve and cost money. But the uncertainty itself takes you into a very dark chapter of unknown, and that is a big question as to whether we can weather that. Now, if you could have more detail on what might happen and agreements, but they're not there. And the Brexit campaign, and I don't know if Liam Fox was able to expand on this, but nobody knows these questions, and that's what is very worrying.
I think, in fact, when Liam was here, I think there was an overarching sense that don't worry, everyone is going to be highly pragmatic and won't seek to punish should
really?
Britain decide to leave. And I think that, and this is, again,
I mean,
sort of the
take
question.
The Eurovision Song Contest. I mean, how does Britain fare in that?
Well,
the result doesn't even matter, really. And look, I mean, is that a fair expression? I jest. But,
no, but some have argued that there, in fact, will be punishment. That if the UK decides to leave, that Europe will be in some ways required to punish to make others less inclined to follow a leave decision. So I think that's where everyone's being either highly pragmatic or going to be punishing the UK for its decision. It's a big question mark.
Yeah,
for
I mean,
sure.
the challenges that we face today on international terrorism, on making sure our economies are able to compete internationally, require collectivity. It requires some sort of pragmatism and requires compromise. You don't get that by stepping outside of the EU, of the European Union. It also requires leadership. And I would argue, and I'm slightly biased here, but Britain has had a couple of hundred years of solid leadership and experience and leverage of actually exacting change in most parts for the better. And on the occasions where we have stepped back and turned our backs on Europe, whether it be Blenheim or whether it be Waterloo or things like that, we've had to then come in, and it's been Britain that's had to assist with the repair. The First and Second World Wars, for example, as well. What happens in Europe affects Britain. We cannot isolate ourselves. We shouldn't see the Channel as some form of moat. We should actually see it as a highway of which we can connect not only with Europe but the rest of the world.
Absolutely. We had some more questions here. Yes, Mr. Ambassador. Yes, thank you.
Petr Gandelovic, the Czech ambassador. Well, I believe there will be more countries in the European Union which will not want to punish UK, whatever happens on the 23rd. The Czech Republic definitely won't be supportive of any punishment. Us remembering our own split with Slovakia, and that it needed to involve a lot of pragmatism and a lot of, I would say, good measures between the two in order to maintain a high level of comfort for instance, citizens who found themselves on the other side of a split. And let me ask you a question. Maybe I'm ignorant, but I do not follow all these analysis that close. Could you give us a more detailed overview on the demographies and maybe constituencies? What does Labour say? What do different constituents say about the split?
Thank you. I think we had one other question. Oh, over here, right here. And then I promise I'll get the one in the back. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Minister. Robert Grant, I used to be with the embassy here, and I now work for Mitsubishi Corporation. A couple of questions. First of all, how do you see the way that the media and the press in the UK is shaping arguments, and to what extent are they being influential? Might be a difficult question to answer, but please give it a go. And secondly, I personally don't understand it, and I suspect others in Washington don't. Some of the more recent arguments include the effect on the NHS. I'm not sure I really understand how that plays into this. And secondly, as was mentioned earlier, former Prime Ministers Major and Blair have been in Northern Ireland today. To what extent is the Northern Ireland and the broader constitutional settlement discussion playing? Is that important, and how influential do you think that's going to be? Thank you.
Thank you. Would you take those, and then we'll take one more, and then we'll close.
Thank you very much indeed. I mean, the question, pleased to see the Czech Republic is not going to punish Britain, whatever the case is. We're strong allies with the Czech Republic. It's a pleasure to see you here. But it isn't necessarily using the word punishment, which I think is too strong. I think it's simply the absence of a pace of introducing regulations or the new sets of rules that we will have to abide by. It takes a while for agreements to be made. The Canadian agreement with the EU has taken 10 years, and this is quite a simple agreement. It's still not even signed. So whatever agreement we will have with the Czech Republic, if it's a binary bilateral agreement, or indeed with the EU, will take time itself. So you might not necessarily want to as a country, damage any relationship or any trade agreements as such like that. But inherently in the logistics and the challenges of getting all the clerical issues out of the way in administration, businesses will be affected. And that's the consequence of actually what could actually happen. But it could also be that there are MPs that decide for their own reasons, and they may not be of centre-right parties, there might be others, to say, actually, it's not in our interest to allow British components or whatever to come into our country because it'll affect our local businesses, and therefore I'm not going to be inclined to be too quick to make that agreement to come. These are a number of scenarios which we can actually see happening. I'd love to think that everybody will be, sorry to see us go and be knocking on our doors to say, please, here's something I've thought up, let's have that in place. I can't see that happening straight away, indeed. We would be at the back of the queue to sign up, and that's been made very clear by the President of the EU herself. The constituents, Labour have formally come out with the position. I think so have the Green Party, so have the Scottish Nationalists. I think a couple of Northern Ireland parties have also established themselves. I think the absolute majority of parties themselves are firmly in favour of Remain. It is the Conservative Party which officially has no position, and individuals are free to then campaign and participate as they wish. The governance position is very, very clear, which is why I put a leaflet out, which we've got a little bit of coverage, but it make it very, very clear that back in the referendum in '75, the government put out a leaflet then. And when we had a referendum on the alternative vote system that we had, the government put out a leaflet then. The government has form in putting leaflets out to put its own position forward. And today, this time, Scotland, for example, a leaflet went out saying the position was for Scotland to actually remain. So leaflets went out all the time, and people seem to forget that. Whether it's wise or not, I think funding perhaps could have been sorted from somewhere else, which might have made it easier. The media is a really good question as to the role that they actually play. We have a very powerful media in the UK, and they are taking positions. And the Daily Mail is in one position. The Mail on Sunday is very much in favour of Remain. And I find it very frustrating that a debate, and you mentioned the Prime Minister's debate on, I watched the entire thing, and there was one awkward question, I think, on migration, and suddenly that was a reflection of the entire debate, and it wasn't. If you saw the entire debate, actually, I thought the Prime Minister handled it well and made it very, very clear that Nigel Farage didn't have many of the answers, and a lot of what he was doing was going on passion and on appealing to the heart to say that somehow Britain is going to be fantastic outside the EU. So the role of the media, we have to be very careful in and encourage it to be as responsible as possible. And that's why a lot of people are actually ignoring the media on a daily basis, but are going into this forum to ask the questions and going to the detail that often is the banner headlines are actually avoiding. The NHS as a question, the National Health Service, this is tied into TTIP, and it's to whether or not, if we strike this transatlantic trade and investment partnership with the United States, that somehow the NHS will be forced to be open up to privatization. And we've had guarantees from the Americans, from the British, and from the European Union that that is absolutely not the case. And this is a scare story that's actually got a little bit out of hand. The NHS is, there are aspects of competition which come in, but no, it will remain as it very much is. I'm glad I was able to answer that question.
I think there's some question on the NHS that the money that could be saved from not paying into the EU budget could then be repatriated to the NHS. There's that angle as well.
Where does the 100 billion or so that's spent onto the NHS, where does it come from? It comes from the economy. It comes from the taxpayers paying in and from the economy doing well. If the economy takes a hit because we leave the EU, then there will not be the money in the budget for George Osborne to give to the NHS. So it's counterproductive to say somehow the savings that we've made. And the savings are actually, as I say, a bit of a misnomer. They're less than 1% of GDP. It's a small amount. Once you take away the Margaret Thatcher rebate, once the agricultural subsidies that come back to us, and the other regional subsidies, it works out at about £4.5 billion. So, but the benefits to that in £33 billion worth in the financial services alone is focused on in Europe itself. So it's the amount of money that we benefit by being, the cost of membership of this club, the benefits far outweigh the actual costs themselves.
Fantastic. I'm going to have one last question. If you can keep it extremely short, sir. One in the back, and then we will close out.
Hi, thank you. Abbas from Kurdistan 24. My question is to why? Why you are decided to go separated from European Union, and why is now? Because you are saying the future is not clear. And there is so many risks. So why the decision of doing this?
This may be the one question that links your work in the Middle East to the conversation we're having on the referendum. Why now?
Why now? Well, we came up with the EU referendum bill, which is now an act, during the coalition time. It never got over the line because the coalition, the Liberal Democrats, weren't keen to actually have the referendum itself. The timing of the referendum, whenever is a good time to have a referendum? And lots of factors were put in. It was, almost like the Schrodinger's wave equation of all the factors that sort of come in with an answer to spit out, this is a good time to have it. Even when the World Cup is, or the Olympic Games, all these sort of things. When can we focus on this and not be distracted by other factors? And on top of that, you have the unknowns of what's going to actually happen. The refugee crisis wasn't something that 2 years ago we necessarily anticipated happening at this time, although it has died down immensely. But the question has been put, and as I said at the very, very beginning, it is one that I think does need answering. The European Union does need to go under the microscope. It does need to reform in order to make sure that countries such as Britain, and indeed others, and the people recognize the actual benefits itself. So it has been absolutely a difficult exercise, but I think on the 23rd of June, we will look back at this and say, that was tough. That was very, very difficult indeed. But now we have a very powerful argument to say, let's continue that reform.
Well, I can say it was a very good time to have you with us to help explain this very important referendum with important implications for Europe and for the United States. Please join with me with your applause in thanking Tobias Elwood for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Is that right?
That was great. Great workout.